Welcome, listeners, to a journey unlike any you have embarked upon before, not into the romanticized fables of knights and castles, but into the raw, sensory-laden heart of a time often dismissed with a dismissive wave as the Dark Ages. Forget the simplistic narratives. This is the true, unvarnished reality of the year of our Lord 847, where every breath was a testament to survival, and every sunrise a fragile victory. We stand on the precipice of a new day in Ethelberg, a small, stubborn Saxon village, clinging to existence like a tenacious vine on the very edge of the vast, ancient, and deeply mysterious Weald Forest. The pre-dawn air, long before the first hint of rose appeared on the eastern horizon, was a tangible entity here. It wasn't just cold, it was a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep into the very marrow, carrying with it the undeniable tang of damp earth, the pungent, comforting aroma of wood smoke curling lazily from countless hearths, and something else, something profoundly wild and untamed that radiated from the impenetrable depths of the whispering woods. This scent was a constant companion, a subtle reminder of the primeval forces that governed their lives. Inside the humble wattle and daub hut, its thatched roof a masterpiece of practical engineering against the elements, Elara stirred from a fitful sleep. The rustling of the coarse straw beneath her was a sound as familiar and inescapable as her own heartbeat. The hut, though offering a rudimentary shelter, was a sieve against the biting cold that seemed to cling to every rough-hewn beam, every crack in the mud-plastered walls. Her breath, a visible plume in the frigid air, briefly caught the last, defiant glimmer of dying embers in the central hearth, a miniature sun sinking slowly into a bed of ash. The silence, when it wasn't punctuated by the soft, rhythmic creaks of the hut's timbers expanding and contracting with the temperature shift, or the mournful, distant hoot of a tawny owl from the forest's edge, was not merely the absence of sound. It was a profound, almost oppressive presence, a silence pregnant with the unseen, the unheard, and the utterly unknown. There was no distant hum of wheeled traffic, no faint glow of electric light bleeding through window panes, only the profound, almost suffocating weight of the night, broken only by the faint, diffused shimmer of countless stars, like scattered diamonds on black velvet, peeking through the smoke hole directly above the hearth. Elara's world was one defined by an unceasing, almost primal vigilance. The line between life and death was not a philosophical concept but a practical, tangible reality, as thin and fragile as the threadbare wool of her shift, woven years ago from the sheep her family tended. She was a woman of 25 winters, but her hands, though still capable of delicate needlework for mending clothes, were calloused not by leisure or craft, but by the relentless, demanding rhythm of planting stubborn seeds in unforgiving soil, harvesting meager crops under a fickle sky, weaving endless yards of cloth, and the countless, back-breaking chores that kept the small household unit from succumbing to the harsh realities of their age. Her face, while possessing the remnants of youthful softness, already bore the subtle, indelible etching of ceaseless hardship, eyes that had witnessed too much struggle and sorrow, a mouth that often knew the pangs of hunger, but also a quiet, unyielding strength that radiated from her very being, a resilience forged in the crucible of daily survival. She lay for a long moment, a deliberate pause before facing the demands of the day, her senses acutely attuned to the delicate balance of life around her. She listened to the steady, deep, almost reassuring breathing of her younger brother, Sinric, a boy of 10, nestled closely beside her for warmth, and the softer, shallower, more fragile breaths of their aging mother, Lyra, who slept on a separate pallet near the hearth, her body bowed by years of labor and recurring coughs. Sleep in Ethelberg was never a deep, unburdened slumber, it was a fragile, fleeting peace, easily shattered by the sudden, guttural howls of wolves venturing too close to the village periphery, the distant, chilling cries of unseen raiders on the ancient tracks, or the terrifyingly swift onset of a fever, a malicious, unseen entity that could claim a cherished life by morning light, often before the sun had even fully risen. The darkness outside their meager hut was not merely the absence of light, it was a palpable, almost malevolent presence, a vast, oppressive shroud that held within its inky depths untold dangers, predatory wild beasts whose glowing eyes might peer from the undergrowth, rival Saxon clans with grudges as old as the hills, or worse, the ever-present, terrifying shadow of the Norsemen, whose sleek, dragon-prowed longboats were whispered to be creeping ever closer to these vulnerable shores, their raids leaving trails of fire and despair. Elara knew, with an instinctive, chilling dread that had settled deep into the very core of her bones, that the approaching dawn would not usher in an era of ease or respite, but merely a different, yet equally demanding, set of challenges. It was a relentless, cyclical struggle for existence in a world that was always, profoundly and unexpectedly harder than any modern mind, wrapped in the comforts of electric light and running water, could possibly imagine. The very air itself, thick with the sense of a primitive existence, seemed to vibrate with an unseen, constant tension, a silent promise of the unyielding struggle that defined every single moment of life in this boring and utterly unforgiving age. The weight of this understanding settled upon her, a heavy mantle she had worn since childhood, a silent testament to the hardness that permeated every fiber of their being. The first stirrings of day, a symphony of scarcity. The first faint, bruised purple blush began to stain the eastern sky, not a vibrant sunrise, but a slow, grudging seep of light that seemed hesitant to break the night's absolute dominion. Inside Elara's hut, the subtle shift in the quality of the darkness was her signal. She moved with practiced economy, her body accustomed to the specific dimensions of their cramped living space. Her bare feet, toughened by years of contact with cold earth floors and rough tracks, made no sound as she rose from her straw pallet. The fire, which had dwindled to a few stubborn, glowing coals, needed immediate attention. Life itself revolved around the hearth. It was the heart of the home, offering warmth, light, and the means to cook the meager rations that sustained them. Without fire, there was no cooked food, no boiled water to reduce the ever-present risk of illness, and no defense against the creeping damp and chill that invited sickness into the bones. Elara carefully reached for a small, woven basket near the hearth, retrieving a handful of dried kindling, tiny twigs, brittle bark, and a few precious pieces of seasoned wood, carefully saved from yesterday's scavenging. Each piece was valuable, its potential energy a direct measure of their family's daily survival. She knelt, the rough wool of her tunic scraping against the dirt floor, and began to painstakingly arrange the kindling over the glowing embers. Her fingers, despite their calluses, were nimble and precise, remembering the exact angles, the optimal placement to coax a flame back into existence. She lowered her head, her breath a warm, steady stream, and began to blow gently, a soft, rhythmic puffing that slowly, patiently, brought the embers back to life. A thin wisp of smoke, acrid but familiar, curled upwards, carrying the faint, woody scent of the previous day's burning. Then, a tiny spark, like a fleeting star, jumped from a coal, caught hold of a dry twig, and hesitantly blossomed into a fragile, dancing flame. It was a victory, small but significant, repeated every single morning. As the flame tentatively grew, casting flickering shadows that made the hut's interior dance with ghostly forms, Elara reached for the water skins, made of cured animal hide. These had been filled at the village well the previous evening, a journey that in itself was not without its risks. The well was a communal space, but also a place where news, gossip, and sometimes, warnings, were exchanged. The water, though vital, was rarely truly clear. Often it held a faint earthy taste, a reminder of the land from which it sprang. She carefully poured some into a small, soot-blackened clay pot, placing it gingerly on a tripod over the nascent flame. The water needed to boil for the morning's gruel, a thin porridge made from ground oats or barley, often supplemented with a few dried berries if they were fortunate enough to have them, or a handful of foraged herbs for flavor and sustenance. While the water slowly heated, Elara's gaze drifted to her brother, Sinric. He was still deep in the slumber of childhood, his small face peaceful, oblivious to the relentless grind that awaited him, and already defined much of his sister's life. He would soon be old enough to join the men in the fields, to learn the crafts of his father's father, but for now, he was still a child, a fragile beacon of hope and innocence in a harsh world. Her mother, Lyra, on the other hand, stirred restlessly on her palate, a soft, hacking cough escaping her lips, a cough that had grown more persistent with each passing winter, a constant, low thrum of worry in Elara's heart. There were no physicians, no pharmacies, no easy remedies in Ethelberg. Healing was a precarious dance with nature, a reliance on ancestral knowledge of herbs and poultices, and above all, on the will of God, or the fates, depending on one's deepest beliefs. The sounds of the hut were now overlaid by the awakening village. First, the crow of a rooster, a ragged, defiant call cutting through the still air. Then, the lowing of a cow from a nearby enclosure, followed by the bleating of a few sheep. Soon, the distant, muffled sounds of other hearths being kindled, faint echoes of breath and crackling wood, would join the chorus. The smell of wood smoke intensified, mingling with the sharper, cleaner scent of morning dew and the earthy aroma of dung from the animal pens. This was not the silence of a deep forest, nor the cacophony of a bustling city. It was the symphony of scarcity and resilience, each sound a testament to the daily struggle for existence. Every single sound had meaning, signaling the awakening of another day of back-breaking labor and uncertain fortunes. The weight of this day, of every day, pressed down on Elara, a familiar and heavy burden, but one she carried with the quiet, unyielding strength that was the true currency of the Dark Ages. The promise of the day was not comfort, but continuity, another cycle of effort, another test of endurance. The water in the clay pot began to murmur, a low, hesitant whisper at first, then a more confident gurgle as tiny bubbles detached themselves from the bottom and shimmered upwards. Soon, a thin plume of steam rose, carrying with it the faint, earthy scent of heated water. Elara moved away from the hearth only long enough to retrieve the small, roughly carved wooden bowls and spoons, laid out neatly on a clean piece of linen on a low shelf. These were among their most prized possessions, crafted with care, passed down through generations. She poured the boiling water into a larger, communal pot, adding the coarsely ground oats. The mixture was stirred patiently with a long wooden paddle, the gruel slowly thickening, transforming from a watery slop into a more substantial, if still bland, sustenance. The rhythmic scraping of the paddle against the pot was a familiar, comforting sound, a prelude to the day's first, most essential meal. As the gruel simmered, filling the hut with its wholesome, if simple, aroma, Elara turned her attention to her mother. Lyra's cough had subsided, but her breathing remained shallow and punctuated by soft wheezes. Elara knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her mother's forehead. It was warm, perhaps a little too warm, but not burning. "Mother," she murmured softly, her voice a low, reassuring tone that rarely betrayed the anxiety that often gnawed at her. "The gruel is nearly ready. You must eat." Lyra's eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that, though clouded by age and weariness, still held a spark of the resilience that had defined her life. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Always watching over me, my little wren," she whispered, her voice raspy. Elara helped her mother to sit up, propping her against the rough wall, mindful of the fragile bones beneath the thin coverings. Cynric, roused by the increasing activity and the tantalizing, if humble, smell of food, finally stirred. He stretched languidly, a child still clinging to the remnants of sleep, his fair hair tousled, his young face marked by the indentations of the straw. He blinked, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and then, seeing the pot on the fire, a small, eager smile spread across his face. "Gruel," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Yes, little wolf," Elara replied, a rare smile gracing her own lips. It was moments like these, fleeting glimpses of normalcy and innocent joy, that provided the quiet strength needed to face the day's looming trials. They ate in a shared silence, punctuated only by the clinking of wooden spoons against bowls and the occasional cough from Lyra. The gruel, while lacking in flavor by modern standards, was warm and filling, providing the necessary calories to fuel their bodies for the strenuous day ahead. Each mouthful was savored, not for its taste, but for its life-sustaining properties. Food was never wasted. Every crumb, every drop, was precious. The texture was coarse, sometimes lumpy, a testament to the basic milling processes of the age, but it was honest food, grown from the earth and prepared by their own hands. Elara ate steadily, her eyes scanning the hut, noting what needed mending, what needed cleaning, what needed tending to. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning the day's tasks, prioritizing based on urgency and the fickle whims of the weather. The first rays of sunlight, thin and watery, began to pierce through the smoke hole and the small gaps in the hut's walls, painting stripes of weak light across the earthen floor. Dust motes, disturbed by their movements, danced in these fleeting beams, miniature constellations in the dim air. The sounds from outside the hut grew clearer now, the distant rhythmic thud of an axe chopping firewood, the sharp bark of a village dog, the low murmur of voices from a neighboring dwelling. The shared silence of their morning meal was a profound experience, a moment of familial connection forged not through elaborate conversations, but through the fundamental act of sharing sustenance, of being present for one another in a world that constantly threatened to tear them apart. It was a silent pact of survival, a testament to the unbreakable bonds that formed the very bedrock of life in Ethelberg. As the last spoonfuls of gruel were scraped from the bowls, the weight of the new day, with its endless demands, settled upon them, urging them forth from the brief, flickering warmth of their hearth. The morning ritual was complete, and the relentless hardness of their existence beckoned once more. With the last of the gruel consumed and the wooden bowls rinsed cursorily with a splash of water, their brief respite within the hut came to an end. The faint, lingering warmth of the hearth, a transient comfort, would soon dissipate as they ventured into the raw chill of the early morning. Elara helped her mother settle back onto her pallet, ensuring she was well covered with the woven wool blankets. "Rest, mother," she urged, her voice soft but firm. "I will be back by midday." Lyra simply nodded, her eyes already drifting closed, seeking the elusive peace of sleep to mend her weary body. Elara then turned to Cynric. "Come, little wolf," she said, her tone shifting slightly, now carrying a hint of the day's demands. "The chickens will be waiting." Cynric, though still groggy, knew the routine. He pulled on his rough tunic and leggings, his movements clumsy with lingering sleep. Elara retrieved their crude wooden clogs from beside the door, simple, hollowed-out pieces of wood, often lined with straw for a modicum of comfort, protecting their feet from the cold, damp earth and the sharp stones that littered the paths. These were not fashioned for aesthetics, but for pure, rugged utility. Pushing aside the thick, animal hide flap that served as their door, Elara stepped out into the nascent day. The air hit her with a bracing shock, sharp and invigorating, far colder than the hut's interior, even with its dying fire. The sky above was now a pale, watery gray, the clouds still heavy and low, promising perhaps rain or even a late-season frost. The sun, though risen, remained stubbornly hidden behind the thick cloud cover, offering only a diffused, almost melancholic light that painted the world in shades of muted brown and gray. The dew on the grass, still untouched by sunlight, shimmered like scattered pearls, coating everything in a delicate, icy sheen. Ethelberg began to reveal itself in the growing light. It wasn't a village of grand structures or paved streets. It was an organic cluster of some 20 to 30 huts, built primarily from local materials, wattle, daub, timber, and thatch, their irregular shapes blending almost seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. Smoke curled lazily from a dozen or so chimneys, thin columns rising to join the low-hanging mist that still clung to the ground in places. The narrow paths between the huts were not paved, but worn smooth by centuries of countless footsteps, a mix of compacted dirt and scattered pebbles, often slick with mud after rain. Here and there, puddles reflected the gray sky, remnants of yesterday's precipitation. The sounds of the village intensified now. The clucking of hens from a nearby coop, the grunts of pigs rooting in their muddy pens, the bleating of tethered goats. A blacksmith's hammer, its ringing strike muffled by distance, began its rhythmic song from the far end of the village, a testament to vital, ongoing work. A woman's sharp call to her children, a man's gruff voice shouting to his dog, the distant, rhythmic creak of a hand mill grinding grain. These were the daily melodies of Ethelberg, a constant reminder of the communal effort required for survival. Every household was a unit, but the village was the body, interdependent and vital. Elara's eyes, ever watchful, scanned the immediate surroundings. She noted the fresh tracks of a fox near the chicken coop, a constant threat that needed to be managed. She observed the state of her small kitchen garden, its few hardy herbs and root vegetables still sleeping under the chill. Her gaze swept towards the treeline of the wheeled forest, dark and ominous even in the emerging light, its ancient boughs shrouded in a lingering mist. The forest was their provider, offering wood, forage, and game, but it was also a place of unpredictable dangers, wild animals, unseen pathways, and the lurking fear of human threats. Cynric, his initial sleepiness now replaced by a child's natural energy, darted ahead towards the small, fenced-off chicken run adjacent to their hut. The chickens, a motley collection of scrawny, often muddy birds, clucked excitedly as they saw him approach, anticipating their meager morning scattering of grain. Elara followed, her mind already shifting gears, preparing for the endless tasks that lay before her. The village was awake, and with its awakening came the renewed commitment to the day's toil. There was no time for idleness, no room for complaint. The struggle for existence in the Dark Ages was a continuous, unforgiving cycle, and each morning demanded its own relentless tribute of labor. The cold air, the muted light, the earthy scents, all were stark reminders that this was a world forged in hardship, a world where every single day was indeed, demonstrably, harder than anyone could think. The small, rickety gate to the chicken run creaked open, a sound that immediately sent a flurry of clucking and wing flapping through the flock. Cynric, with the natural ease of a child accustomed to animals, quickly moved among the hens, his small hands expertly gathering the eggs from their straw nests. Each egg was a small, fragile miracle, a concentrated package of protein and sustenance, a vital contribution to their meager diet. He carefully placed them into a small, shallow basket Elara had given him, his movements slow and deliberate, knowing the value of each one. Some days, there were only a few, on others, a precious half-dozen. Today, they were fortunate. 6 small, speckled eggs rested carefully in the basket, a tangible sign of the day's first harvest. While Cynric tended to the hens, scattering a handful of salvaged grains as a reward, Elara moved to the small, enclosed vegetable patch adjacent to their hut. This was her domain, a small square of earth coaxed into reluctant productivity. The soil here was thin and stony, requiring endless hours of digging, weeding, and enriching with ash from the hearth and the precious manure from their small collection of animals. The concept of vast, fertile fields was alien to their immediate surroundings. Every inch of cultivated land was a hard-won battle against nature. She knelt, her fingers, despite the morning chill, deftly probing the soil around the stubborn root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and a few hardy cabbages that had miraculously survived the previous autumn. These were not the plump, perfect specimens found in modern markets. They were gnarled, often small, but packed with the earthy resilience that mirrored their own. Elara carefully twisted and pulled, extracting a few turnips from the cold ground, shaking off the clinging soil. The sound of earth yielding to her touch was a familiar comfort. These would form the basis of their evening meal, perhaps combined with some dried meat if they were lucky, or more gruel. The small, gnawing worry of food security was a constant companion, a dull ache beneath all other thoughts. There was no assurance of tomorrow's meal. Every day was a negotiation with the land, the weather, and the ever-present threat of disease or raid. A bad harvest meant hunger, and prolonged hunger meant weakness, illness, and, ultimately, death. This stark reality imbued every successful harvest, however small, with a profound sense of gratitude and urgency. As she worked, her senses were keenly aware of the village around her. The air was now thick with the layered scents of morning. The sharp, metallic tang from the blacksmith's forge carried on the breeze. The earthy sweetness of freshly turned soil from a nearby plot. The acrid, lingering smell of wood smoke from their own and neighboring hearths, and the pervasive, underlying scent of farm animals and human habitation. These were the smells of life, raw and unfiltered, far removed from the sanitized environments of the future. Her mind, however, was already moving beyond the immediate chores of the homestead. The true, laborious work of the day lay in the communal fields, a short walk from the village perimeter. These were the shared lands, worked by all able-bodied men and women, where the bulk of the village's grain, wheat, barley, and oats, was grown. The concept of individual land ownership, as understood in later eras, was fluid here. Land was held in common, worked in common, and its yield shared, at least in principle, for the survival of the collective. It was a brutal, demanding existence, relying entirely on manual labor, the strength of their own backs, and the raw power of their few oxen or horses. There were no complex machines, no mechanized plows, only the artist's repetitive strain of muscle and bone. Elara knew that once her tasks within the village were complete, tending to her mother, preparing the hut for the day, perhaps a quick repair to a torn garment, her place would be in those fields. The season dictated the work: plowing, sowing, weeding, or, as autumn drew closer, the exhaustive, communal effort of the harvest. Today, it would likely be weeding, a seemingly endless task, bending over rows, pulling up tenacious invaders that threatened to choke the life out of their precious crops. It was a monotonous, back-breaking labor that stretched from dawn until dusk, under the unyielding gaze of the sun or the biting lash of the wind. The thought was not one of dread, but of inevitability. It was simply what had to be done. The daily harvest, whether of eggs from a hen or roots from the ground, was a direct, tangible link to survival, a constant reminder that in the dark ages, every calorie, every breath, was earned through relentless, unceasing effort. And the fields, waiting patiently under the gray sky, represented the most significant, and most demanding, part of that daily bargain. With the eggs gathered and a few turnips secured, Elara carefully closed the gate to the chicken run. Sinric, still clutching the basket of eggs, looked up at her expectantly. "Can I take them to Mother?" he asked, his eyes wide with a child's desire to contribute. Elara nodded, a soft smile. "Be careful, little wolf. And stay inside with her. I must go to the fields now." She watched him disappear into the hut, the hide flap falling back into place, momentarily sealing off their small world from the larger one. A pang of worry, a familiar companion, tightened in her chest. Leaving her mother, ailing and vulnerable, was never easy, but the demands of the collective survival outweighed individual anxieties. She retrieved her own tools from near the hut's entrance: a small, sturdy digging stick, its tip hardened by fire, and a woven basket for carrying anything she might forage or collect. Her hands, already rough, gripped the familiar wood. Straightening her shoulders, she began her walk towards the edge of the village, towards the path that led to the communal fields. The path itself was a living artery of Ethelberg. It wasn't a neatly paved road, but a winding, deeply rutted track, worn smooth and uneven by countless footsteps, cart wheels, and the hooves of livestock over generations. Patches of mud, still stubbornly clinging from yesterday's rain, forced her to pick her way carefully, her wooden clogs sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air here was a mix of scents: the sweet, cloying aroma of pig pens, the sharp ammonia tang of stale urine, the musty smell of damp thatch, and the ever-present, pervasive scent of wood smoke, mingling with the fresh, clean breath of the surrounding nature. As she walked, the village awakened around her, not with a sudden burst of activity, but with a gradual, deliberate unfurling of daily life. From other huts, figures emerged, men and women, young and old, their faces etched with the same weariness and resilience that marked her own. They moved with a shared sense of purpose, a silent understanding of the day's demands. A group of men, burly and taciturn, were already leading a team of oxen, their broad backs straining against the rudimentary yokes, towards the fields. The lowing of the oxen, a deep, resonant sound, echoed through the morning air. Their progress was slow, deliberate, each step a testament to the sheer physical effort required to work the land. Near the communal well, a group of women, their heads covered with simple linen cloths, gathered to draw water. Their voices, though low, carried snippets of conversation on the cool breeze: talk of a sick child, concern over a dwindling store of grain, a brief exchange about a neighbor's recent success in hunting. The well was more than a source of water. It was the village's informal meeting point, a hub for the exchange of information, a place where the social fabric was woven and maintained. Elara offered a brief nod of greeting to a few familiar faces, receiving similar acknowledgments in return. There was little time for lengthy pleasantries in a world where every moment was precious. Children, despite the early hour, were already afoot, some herding a few errant chickens, others chasing each other in games that mimicked the adults' daily struggles. Their laughter, though fleeting, a sharp, joyous counterpoint to the underlying seriousness of adult life. Their bare feet, impervious to the cold, danced over the rough ground. Even the village dogs, lean and watchful, began their patrols, sniffing at every post, every bush, their tails occasionally wagging in greeting. Elara's keen eyes took in every detail, every subtle shift in the village's rhythm. She noticed a newly mended section of a hut wall, a testament to someone's recent labor. She saw the wisps of smoke from the communal bakery, where the village's meager flour would be transformed into life-sustaining bread. She observed the worried frown on the face of old Theron, the village elder, as he watched the sky, perhaps anticipating a change in the weather that could spell disaster for the crops. Every glance, every observation, was a piece of information, contributing to her understanding of the village's collective well-being. As she reached the village boundary, marked by a rough, log fence, the sounds of human activity began to recede, replaced by the more open, expansive sounds of the natural world. The wind, no longer broken by huts, sighed through the tall grass of the common grazing lands. The distant caw of a rook from the forest, a warning or a simple greeting, carried on the breeze. Before her lay the path to the fields, and beyond that, the vast, silent expanse of the Weald, a constant, looming presence. The path was not merely a route but a transition, leading from the controlled, communal world of the village to the wild, unpredictable embrace of the land. Elara tightened her grip on her digging stick, preparing herself for the arduous labor that awaited her, a labor that was as old as time itself, and as demanding as the very earth she was about to cultivate. The tapestry of village life, a complex weave of interdependencies and endless effort, stretched out behind her, drawing her forward into the day's relentless demands. The path leading from the village proper to the communal fields was not a straightforward route. It was a winding, ancient track, shaped over centuries by countless footsteps, the slow grind of wooden cartwheels, and the passage of livestock. It snaked through patches of common grazing land, where a few scrawny sheep and a couple of lean, mottled cows grazed listlessly, their breath pluming in the chill air. The grass here was short and tough, hinting at the thinness of the soil beneath. Elara's wooden clogs clicked rhythmically against the frozen clumps of earth, a stark, solitary sound that punctuated the crisp morning air. The air out here was different from the village. It carried less smoke, more of the raw, undiluted scent of earth, damp vegetation, and the subtle, wild perfume of the forest that loomed ever closer. The sky remained a uniform, heavy gray, casting a flat, even light over the landscape that made distances seem vast and colors muted. The wind, though not strong, carried a persistent bite, tugging at her rough wool tunic and making her shiver despite her brisk pace. Her hands, exposed to the elements, began to ache with the cold. As she walked, her senses were heightened, a necessary survival mechanism. Her eyes constantly scanned the path ahead, not just for uneven terrain or hidden stones, but for any sign of disturbance, a broken branch, fresh animal tracks, or something more ominous. Every rustle in the nearby hedgerows, every distant bird call, was processed, analyzed, instinctively categorized as either harmless or a potential threat. The world of the Dark Ages was not benign. Danger lurked in myriad forms, often unseen, often unexpected. A misstep could mean a twisted ankle, a foraging animal could be a hungry predator, and the appearance of a lone stranger on the path could signify anything from a lost traveler to a desperate bandit or even a lone Norse scout. She passed by patches of gnarled, ancient trees that marked the transition from open grazing land to more dense woodland. These were not the managed forests of later times, but wild, untamed woodlands, their branches interwoven into an almost impenetrable canopy. The sounds shifted subtly here. The closer whisper of leaves, the sharper call of woodland birds, the faint, trickling sound of a hidden stream. The air grew heavier, cooler, filled with the scent of damp moss and decaying leaves. The path narrowed, becoming a tunnel of muted light beneath the overarching branches. Elara recalled stories, passed down by her grandmother by the firelight, of travelers lost in these very woods, of strange creatures sighted, of ancient spirits that guarded the deep places. These were not mere fairy tales. They were warnings, etched into the collective consciousness of the village. Even now, in the pragmatic light of morning, a shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced its way down her spine as she moved through the shadowy stretch. Her grip on her digging stick tightened, a small, yet comforting weight in her hand. After what felt like a considerable walk, the trees began to thin again, giving way to more open, undulating terrain. Here, the first glimpses of the communal fields appeared, vast, uneven swaths of dark earth, some already showing the faint green fuzz of sprouting crops, others lying fallow, waiting for their turn to be plowed. The sheer scale of the fields, even though they were relatively small by modern agricultural standards, was impressive. It was a testament to the monumental, ceaseless effort of the entire village. Figures were already visible in the distance, small, bent shapes toiling against the earth. The sounds of their labor, though still faint, began to carry on the wind. The rhythmic swing of a hoe, a shouted command, the distant creak of a plow. These were the sounds of communal effort, of shared burden and shared purpose. Elara felt a subtle shift in her own bearing as she approached, a sense of belonging to this larger, working body. Her individual worries about her mother, about Sinric, did not vanish, but they were momentarily subsumed into the larger, unifying purpose of the day. She increased her pace, eager to join the others, to contribute her strength to the endless task of coaxing sustenance from the reluctant earth. The journey to the fields was not just a physical transition, it was a mental and spiritual one, preparing her for the long hours of repetitive, exhausting labor that awaited. The path she walked was not just dirt and stones, it was a lifeline, connecting her home to the source of their very survival, a stark reminder that in the dark ages, even the most mundane journey carried an undercurrent of challenge and a profound sense of purpose. Every step was a step deeper into the unyielding, harder than you think, reality of their lives. As Elara finally reached the edge of the sprawling communal fields, the scale of the morning's labor unfolded before her in stark relief. This was not a picture of pastoral idyll, it was a raw, visceral tableau of human effort against the unyielding earth. The fields, stretching as far as the eye could see under the gray, indifferent sky, were a patchwork quilt of browns and muted greens. Some sections lay fallow, churned by the recent plowing into thick, dark furrows, waiting for the spring sowing. Others, sown earlier, showed the delicate, emerald green shoots of young wheat or barley, barely visible against the dark soil, yet promising the future. The air here was filled with the powerful, primal sense of freshly turned earth, damp clay, and the musky aroma of sweat, already beginning to rise from the workers. The sounds were a rhythmic symphony of human and animal toil. The deep, resonant grunts of oxen straining against their yokes, the metallic scrape of hoes against stony ground, the dull thud of mattocks breaking up stubborn clods, and the low, often guttural, commands exchanged between the workers. There was little unnecessary chatter. Energy was too precious to be wasted on idle words. Around 50 villagers, men and women of all ages, were already scattered across the vast expanse, moving with a tireless, almost machine-like efficiency. Their bodies, clad in rough tunics and leggings, were bent over, their faces often obscured by the effort, their movements precise and repetitive. This was the human engine that powered Ethelberg's survival. There were no machines beyond the most basic of tools, the wooden plow, often tipped with iron if they were fortunate, the simple hoe, the mattock, and the digging stick. Every furrow, every planted seed, every weed removed was the direct result of muscle, sinew, and unrelenting willpower. Elara joined a group of women near a section of newly sprouted barley, their backs already aching from hours of stooping. She recognized old Brigid, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands gnarled but surprisingly strong. Beside her worked Lyra's cousin, Freya, a woman of Elara's own age, whose pregnancy was barely beginning to show beneath her loose tunic, a quiet testament to the continuity of their harsh lives. A brief nod, a shared glance of understanding, was the only greeting exchanged. Words were superfluous, the shared burden was acknowledgement. Enough. Elara reached for a simple, short-handled hoe, its iron blade worn smooth by countless seasons of use. She positioned herself in a row, her eyes immediately focusing on the task. Weeding was a relentless, tedious, yet utterly vital part of the agricultural cycle. Every weed was a competitor, stealing precious nutrients and water from the nascent grain. To neglect it was to invite hunger, to risk the very survival of the village. She bent at the waist, her spine already feeling the strain, and began the rhythmic motion: swing, chop, pull. The dull thud of the hoe against the earth, the soft tearing sound of roots being severed, the subtle shifting of soil, these were the intimate sounds of her labor. The work was monotonous, yet utterly demanding. Hours blended into a continuous cycle of bending, swinging, pulling, straightening briefly to ease the cramp in her back, then bending again. The sun, though still hidden, was slowly beginning to exert its presence, and the air grew warmer, the chill receding, replaced by a growing dampness of sweat. Her muscles, though accustomed to the strain, began to protest, a dull ache spreading through her shoulders and lower back. Her mind, however, learned to disassociate, to find a rhythm within the repetition, allowing her thoughts to drift, even as her hands continued their unceasing work. She thought of her mother, warm in the hut, of Sinric, perhaps playing quietly by the hearth, of the small, precious supply of dried berries she had carefully hidden for a rare treat. These small, private thoughts were the mental fuel that kept her going, anchors in the vast ocean of physical exertion. Occasionally, a male voice would call out a warning or a direction, or a child, old enough to contribute, would run through the rows, carrying water skins for the parched workers. The scent of turned earth, damp and rich, filled her nostrils with every swing of the hoe. Her hands became coated in a fine layer of soil, her fingernails already packed with dirt. This was the very essence of their existence, a direct, physical connection to the land that sustained them. There was no escaping it, no modern convenience to lighten the load. The fields of Ethelberg were a testament to human resilience, a living, breathing machine of toil, and Elara, a vital cog in its relentless operation, worked on, hour after grinding hour, under the indifferent gaze of the ancient sky, knowing that the boring history of her day was, in truth, a continuous, profound struggle for survival, far harder and more demanding than any chronicle could truly convey. The sun, having finally broken through the stubborn cloud cover, now hung low in the southern sky, marking the passage from morning to midday. Its light, though weak and filtered, brought a welcome, if fleeting, warmth to the vast, open fields. The workers, who had been toiling relentlessly since dawn, felt the subtle shift in the air, a tacit signal that a brief respite was approaching. The rhythmic sounds of hoes and mattocks began to slow, their insistent beat softening as muscles grew weary and stomachs began to loudly protest their emptiness. Elara straightened up, a sharp groan escaping her lips as her back protested the sustained arching. For a long moment, she simply stood, hands pressed into the small of her back, eyes closed against the mild glare, trying to realign her aching spine. Her tunic was damp with sweat, clinging uncomfortably to her skin, and her face was streaked with dirt and perspiration. The taste of dust was heavy in her mouth, a constant companion. All around her, other figures slowly straightened, their movements mirroring her own, a collective sigh of exhaustion rippling across the field. A communal call echoed across the field, a simple, guttural cry that signified the midday break. Instantly, the tools were laid down, the silence that followed almost deafening after hours of constant noise. Workers began to converge towards the edge of the field, near a small, gnarled oak tree that offered the only meager shade. This was the traditional meeting point, a place where a few rough wooden benches, crafted from felled logs, provided a rare opportunity to sit. Elara made her way towards the tree, her legs feeling heavy and stiff, her feet aching inside her wooden clogs. She found a space on one of the benches, carefully lowering herself down, a small sigh of relief escaping her lips as her weight was finally off her feet. Around her, a similar scene unfolded. Men and women, their faces drawn with fatigue, sat or knelt, reaching for the small, wrapped bundles of food they had brought from their huts. There was no elaborate meal. Lunch in the Dark Ages was purely utilitarian. From her own worn linen pouch, Elara extracted a piece of coarse, dark bread, a flat, unleavened round baked yesterday in the communal oven, hard and dense, designed for longevity more than taste. Beside it, she found a single, small piece of dried, smoked fish, its flesh tough and salty, and a few dried berries she had managed to gather and preserve from the previous autumn. This was her entire meal, her sole source of replenishment for the remainder of the day's back-breaking labor. She broke off a piece of the bread, its crust resistant, and chewed slowly, deliberately, allowing each mouthful to be thoroughly masticated before swallowing. The taste was plain, but it was sustenance, a direct antidote to the gnawing hunger in her belly. The conversation that rose from the scattered groups was low, practical, and often punctuated by yawns or the sounds of chewing. Talk revolved around the immediate concerns: the progress of the crops, the signs of rain or drought, the health of a neighbor's ox, the latest whispers of Viking raids from distant coastal villages. There was no talk of grand philosophy, no discussions of distant lands or abstract ideas. Life was too immediate, too tangible, too focused on the grim realities of survival. Every word, every thought, was tethered to the harsh ground beneath their feet. Elara listened, half hearing, as she ate, her gaze drifting over the faces of her fellow villagers. She saw the same weariness, the same quiet determination. She saw the hands, thick and calloused, mirroring her own. These were the people with whom she shared everything: the labor, the fears, the meager joys. They were a collective, bound together by the unforgiving demands of their existence. No one was truly alone in Ethelberg, for loneliness was a luxury they could ill afford. The sun, now at its zenith, cast short, intense shadows, but its warmth was fleeting, barely penetrating the layers of exhaustion. The short break, perhaps no more than a quarter of an hour, felt both agonizingly brief and a profound blessing. As the last crumbs of bread were consumed and the last sips of water swallowed from the shared water skin, a subtle shift began to occur. A few individuals, their hunger temporarily appeased, began to rise, stretching their stiff limbs, preparing for the second half of the day's relentless toil. The brief respite was over. The boring history of their day, far from being dull, was an unceasing marathon of physical endurance, a testament to the fact that even the simple act of eating lunch was a strategic imperative, a refueling for the continuous, undeniable hardness of their lives in the Dark Ages. The fields, stretching out endlessly, beckoned them back to their silent, unyielding labor, as the midday break drew to a close and the workers slowly began to disperse back to their designated sections of the field. A new, unsettling undercurrent began to ripple through the assembly. The practical conversations about crops and weather, though still present, gave way to hushed whispers and worried glances. Old Theron, the village elder, his face typically stoic, now wore a distinct frown as he spoke in low tones with a few of the older men, his gaze occasionally darting towards the distant tree line of the Weald forest. Elara, as she retrieved her hoe and prepared to return to the relentless task of weeding, overheard snippets of these hushed conversations. Words like longships, eastern coast, and burnt settlements drifted on the crisp air. The fear of the Norsemen, the Vikings, was a pervasive, almost genetic dread that lay deep within the collective consciousness of their Saxon community. These were not mere raiding parties seeking quick plunder. These were often large, well-organized forces, arriving with terrifying speed, leaving behind a trail of desolation and death. Their very name invoked a primal terror that transcended the everyday hardships of their lives. The news, though unconfirmed and likely delayed, traveled slowly but surely along the ancient paths, carried by merchants, itinerant monks, or desperate refugees fleeing violence. A whisper could become a roar in their minds, feeding the ever-present anxiety. A distant smoke plume on the horizon, an abandoned hamlet, a traveler's terrified tale, any of these could be the precursor to a full-scale assault. The Dark Ages were not just about battling nature, they were about battling an unseen, unpredictable enemy that could descend with the ferocity of a wolf pack. Elara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Her thoughts immediately flew back to her mother, vulnerable in their hut, and to Sinric, still a child, too young to understand the true nature of the dangers that lurked beyond the village's humble palisade. There was no standing army to protect them, no fortified castles within a day's march. Their defense rested on their own meager strength, the strength of their collective numbers, and the simple, often inadequate, wooden palisade that surrounded Ethelberg, a symbol more of defiance than impenetrable security. She glanced at Freya, her cousin, who was now carefully wiping her brow with the back of her hand, her eyes wide with a similar, unspoken dread. The fragility of life, already so keenly felt through hunger and sickness, was amplified immeasurably by the constant threat of human violence. A Viking raid could wipe out their entire community in a single, brutal day, leaving nothing but ashes and memories. Their fields, their huts, their very existence, all could be extinguished without warning. The renewed work in the fields, usually a source of focused monotony, now felt different. Each swing of the hoe, each stoop to pull a weed, was imbued with a new urgency, a frantic desire to contribute, to secure what little they had against an uncertain future. The silence, previously filled with the sounds of labor, now seemed heavier, punctuated by the growing hum of anxiety. The wind, which had felt merely brisk before, now seemed to carry the faint, imagined cries of distant victims. Old Theron's voice, though low, carried a certain gravitas. He spoke of sending out scouts, young, swift-footed men who knew the forest paths, to ascertain the truth of the rumors. He spoke of preparing the village, of readying their few rudimentary weapons, spears tipped with scavenged iron, axes honed sharp, bows strung with gut. The community, though weary, would stand together. It was their only option. Elara's own senses seemed to sharpen. She scanned the horizon more frequently, her ears straining for any unusual sound from the forest. The knowledge that such devastating forces existed, that they might be closer than anyone dared to imagine, added another layer of hardness to an already incredibly demanding existence. The boring history of their day was anything but. It was a constant tightrope walk between survival and annihilation, between the relentless struggle against nature and the terrifying, arbitrary violence of man. The distant whispers of the world beyond Ethelberg were a stark, chilling reminder that their lives, their very breath, hung by the slenderest of threads. The whispers about the Norsemen, though still unconfirmed, hung heavy in the air, transforming the monotonous rhythm of fieldwork into a tense, almost desperate dance. Every swing of Elara's hoe felt heavier, imbued with a new sense of urgency. The collective fear, while unspoken for the most part, was a tangible force, binding them together in a way that mere communal labor could not. It was a shared burden, pressing down on every man and woman toiling in the field, a reminder that their individual fates were inextricably linked to the survival of the village itself. As the sun began its slow descent, its light turning from pale yellow to a softer, more golden hue, the weariness in Elara's limbs deepened, but her resolve stiffened. She glanced at Freya, who now worked beside her, her movements more labored, her brow furrowed not just with exertion but with unspoken worry. They exchanged a brief, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of the fear that resonated between them. In this era, empathy wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. To truly understand the struggles of your neighbor was to understand your own, and to offer help, however small, was to fortify the collective. A group of younger men, their faces grim, detached themselves from their plowing tasks and headed towards the edge of the forest. These were the chosen scouts, swift and silent, tasked with venturing into the unknown, to confirm or deny the terrifying rumors. The entire field watched them go, a collective breath held, a prayer silently offered for their safe return and for good news, or at least, a clear warning. Their departure underscored the precariousness of their existence, the fact that their safety hinged on the bravery of a few. The concept of community in Ethelberg was not an abstract ideal, it was a brutally practical system of survival. There was no social welfare, no distant government to provide aid. A sick family meant fewer hands for the harvest, which in turn threatened the food supply for all. A weak defense meant vulnerability for the entire village. Therefore, every individual's well-being was a direct concern for everyone else. When old Brigid stumbled, another woman instinctively reached out to steady her, their hands, though rough, offering immediate support. When a plow became stuck in particularly stubborn earth, several men would converge, their combined strength straining against the obstacle until it yielded. Elara often found solace in this collective strength. Though her own family was small, the village was her extended kin. She knew that if her mother's cough worsened, there would be others who would share their meager stores of dried herbs or offer a few extra pieces of kindling. If a harvest failed, the strong would help the weak, at least until the brink of their own survival. This wasn't charity, it was mutual assured survival. The bonds forged in the shared crucible of hardship were stronger than any legal contract or abstract loyalty. As the afternoon wore on, and the light began to take on a reddish tint, signifying the approaching evening, the sounds of the field softened once more, a weary cadence. The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows of the toiling figures across the earth. The air grew cooler again, carrying with it the dampness of approaching night. Muscles screamed in protest, joints ached with every movement, and a deep, pervasive exhaustion settled into every bone. Yet, they continued. To stop before the light failed completely was to waste precious hours, to risk the success of the harvest, and to invite hunger in the cold months ahead. The fear of the Norsemen, though ever present, was temporarily pushed to the back of Elara's mind, subsumed by the immediate, physical demands of her labor. Her focus narrowed to the earth beneath her hands, the weeds she was pulling, the slow, incremental progress of her row. This hyper-focus was another survival mechanism, a way to cope with the overwhelming realities of their lives. To think too far ahead, to dwell too much on the what-ifs, was to invite despair. The hardness of their lives was a constant, physical presence, demanding every ounce of their energy and attention, allowing little room for abstract worries, even when those worries were about imminent danger. The collective strength, the shared burden, was what propelled them forward, a silent, powerful force in the face of an uncertain and unforgiving world. The sun finally kissed the western horizon, not with a fiery spectacle, but with a muted, bruised orange glow that quickly faded into the encroaching twilight. The communal fields, which had pulsed with the relentless energy of human labor throughout the day, slowly began to empty. One by one, the bent figures straightened for the last time, groaning softly as stiff muscles protested, and gathered their rudimentary tools. The air grew perceptibly colder, and the dampness that heralded the coming night began to seep into their very bones. Elara, her back screaming in protest, her hands aching and stiff from hours of gripping the hoe, walked slowly from her row. The familiar sense of profound exhaustion settled over her, a heavy cloak draped around her shoulders. Her body craved the warmth of the hearth and the brief respite of rest, yet she knew the day's tasks were far from over. Home offered comfort, but also more chores, more responsibilities. As she joined the slow procession of workers making their way back towards the village, the atmosphere was markedly different from the vibrant, if weary, activity of midday. A hush had fallen, broken only by the shuffle of feet on the dusty path, the occasional cough, or a low, murmuring exchange of parting words. Conversation was sparse. Exhaustion had claimed most voices. Each person was lost in their own thoughts, their own physical discomfort, dreaming of the small, simple comforts awaiting them. The path back to Ethelberg, which had seemed relatively short in the morning's eager light, now stretched out endlessly under the deepening gloom. The familiar landmarks, the gnarled oak, the meandering stream, the ancient standing stones that marked a forgotten boundary, took on a more ominous appearance in the fading light. Shadows lengthened and distorted, turning familiar shapes into monstrous silhouettes. The forest, which had loomed in the distance all day, now felt closer, its dark canopy a hungry maw at the edge of their world, its whispers growing louder in the encroaching stillness. Elara's senses remained on high alert, even in her state of extreme fatigue. The fear of the Norsemen, momentarily suppressed by the demands of labor, crept back into her mind, now magnified by the dim light and the growing sense of vulnerability. Had the scouts returned? What news did they bring? Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, caused her heart to lurch, her eyes instinctively darting towards the source of the sound. The path was not entirely safe, even this close to the village. A lone wolf, a desperate bandit, or indeed, a silent, stealthy raider could be lurking, waiting for the cover of darkness. The air was now heavy with the scent of damp earth and the chill of nightfall. The faint, comforting scent of wood smoke from the village, a beacon of human warmth, began to drift on the breeze, a promise of sanctuary. Elara quickened her pace slightly, drawing on the last reserves of her strength, propelled by the yearning for that familiar smell, that tiny flicker of light. The thought of her mother, waiting patiently, and Cynric, perhaps already asleep by the dying fire, spurred her onwards. Finally, the dim outline of the village palisade emerged from the deepening twilight, a rough but reassuring boundary against the wild. The sight brought a wave of profound relief, a loosening of the tension that had gripped her shoulders all day. As she passed through the rough wooden gate, which would soon be barred for the night, the faint sounds of the village were once more audible, the lowing of animals being brought into their pens, the distant murmur of voices, the crackle of rekindled hearth fires. She walked directly towards her hut, her movements stiff and clumsy with exhaustion. The door flap, a thin membrane between the harsh world outside and the fragile warmth within, beckoned. The long walk home from the fields was not just a physical journey, but a symbolic one, a transition from the brutal, communal labor that defined their daylight hours to the more intimate, if still demanding, sphere of the home. The day's toil was nearing its end, but the hardness of their lives in the dark ages continued to press upon them, a relentless, ever-present force, even as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky. The simple act of pushing aside the animal-hide door flap and stepping back into the low-ceilinged warmth of her hut felt like crossing a threshold into another dimension. The air inside, though thick with the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth, was infinitely more comforting than the biting chill of the encroaching night. The small, central hearth, which had dwindled to embers when she left that morning, now glowed with a renewed, inviting warmth, casting dancing shadows that softened the rough-hewn walls. Cynric, her young brother, sat cross-legged near the fire, meticulously carving a small wooden animal, his face illuminated by the flickering light, a picture of childlike absorption. Their mother, Lyra, lay on her pallet, now awake, her eyes fixed on the entrance, a silent testament to her anxiety during Elara's absence. "Mother," Elara murmured, her voice husky with fatigue, a small smile touching her lips at the sight of them. She knelt by Lyra, her hand automatically reaching to check her mother's forehead. The fever seemed to have lessened, a small mercy. "How are you?" Lyra's smile was weak but genuine. "Better, my wren. And you?" The fields were harsh today. Her mother's unwavering concern, even in her own frailty, was a constant source of quiet strength for Elara. Cynric, sensing Elara's return, put aside his carving and scrambled to his feet. "Sister, are you cold? I kept the fire going." His earnestness, his desire to help, warmed Elara's heart more effectively than the fire itself. "You are a good boy, little wolf," she praised, ruffling his hair. "A very good boy." The small hut, which earlier that morning had seemed a mere shelter, now felt like a true sanctuary, however precarious. This was their haven, their only defense against the unpredictable dangers of the world outside. The rough wooden beams, the mud-plastered walls, the woven thatch, every element of its construction was a testament to their ancestors' ingenuity and their own relentless effort to maintain it. There were no elaborate furnishings, no decorative trinkets. Every item had a purpose, a practical utility in their daily struggle for survival. A small collection of clay pots and wooden bowls sat on a low shelf, a few bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a crude loom, still with an unfinished piece of fabric, stood in a corner. These were the sparse trappings of a life lived on the edge. Elara wasted no time. Despite her aching muscles, she moved with practiced efficiency. The fire needed to be built up further for the evening meal. She added more carefully selected pieces of wood, blowing gently until the flames licked eagerly at the fresh fuel. The aroma of burning wood intensified, filling the small space with a comforting. Then, she retrieved the few turnips she had harvested that morning, and the precious dried fish from their meager larder. There was no vast array of ingredients, no culinary choices. Meals were dictated by what they had managed to grow, forage, or occasionally, what their men had hunted. Cynric, now fully awake and eager to assist, offered to fetch more water from the communal skin. Elara nodded, supervising his careful movements. The simple act of preparing the evening meal was a deeply communal and ritualistic experience. The warmth of the fire, the shared tasks, the anticipation of food, these elements combined to create a rare moment of peace and connection after the harsh demands of the day. As the small pot of turnips and dried fish began to simmer over the fire, emitting a savory, though humble, aroma, Elara felt a fleeting sense of contentment. It was a fragile peace, easily shattered by a persistent cough from her mother, a sudden noise from outside, or a renewed whisper of fear for the world beyond their walls. Yet, for this brief period, within the confines of their small, smoke-filled hut, they were safe, together, nourished by the simple blessings of fire, food, and family. The hardness of the Dark Ages had been temporarily held at bay by the resilience of their spirits and the unyielding strength of their bonds. This was their sanctuary, their fragile beacon in a world consumed by shadow. The aroma of the simmering turnip and dried fish stew, though simple, was intoxicating in the small confines of the hut. It was a smell that spoke of warmth, sustenance, and the fragile comfort of an evening meal after a day of relentless toil. Elara stirred the pot with a long wooden spoon, its surface bubbling gently, the pieces of root vegetable softening, absorbing the salty essence of the fish. She adjusted the pot over the flames, ensuring the heat was even, her movements practiced and automatic, her mind already anticipating the profound satisfaction of putting warm food into her weary body. Finally, when the stew had reached the right consistency, thick enough to be filling, yet not so thick as to quickly deplete their precious stores, Elara ladled it into their 3 wooden bowls. The steam rose, momentarily clouding the air, carrying the humble yet inviting scent. They gathered around the hearth, not at a table, for they had none, but simply on the earthen floor, their bowls balanced carefully on their laps. The light from the fire flickered and danced, painting their faces in shifting hues of orange and shadow, emphasizing the lines of fatigue and the quiet resilience etched upon them. They ate in a largely silent communion, each spoonful a deliberate act of nourishment. The stew, though lacking in complex flavors, was rich in the fundamental taste of the earth and the sea, providing the necessary calories and warmth. Elara observed her mother, Lyra, who ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, her body frail but her spirit still holding firm. Cynric, however, ate with a child's unreserved hunger, his bowl quickly emptied, his eyes bright with satisfaction. Elara found herself watching him, a deep, protective love swelling in her chest. His innocence, his simple joy in a full belly, was a poignant contrast to the harsh realities that loomed over their lives. For Elara, the evening meal was not just about physical sustenance, it was a moment of quiet reflection, a pause in the relentless cycle of labor. As she ate, her mind replayed snippets of the day, the biting cold of dawn, the endless rows of weeds in the field, the ache in her back, the worrying whispers about the Norsemen. She thought of the male scouts who had ventured into the forest, hoping against hope that they would return with news of no immediate danger. The fear was always there, a low thrum beneath the surface of her consciousness, a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. There was no sense of abundance, no leftovers to be carelessly discarded. Every scrap of food was precious, a testament to the effort it took to acquire it. When their bowls were empty, Elara carefully scraped them clean with the edge of her spoon, leaving not a single crumb. The water from the well, lukewarm now, was used to rinse the bowls, the same water they had boiled earlier. Waste was not an option, it was a direct threat to survival. After the meal, a sense of deep, physical contentment settled over them. The warmth from the fire, the fullness in their stomachs, temporarily banished the chill and the pangs of hunger. Lyra leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing, a soft, contented sigh escaping her lips. Cynric, fueled by the food, began to tell Elara about his day, about the wooden animal he was carving, his voice a soft, excited murmur. Elara listened, interjecting with gentle questions, her mind still partially tethered to the anxieties of the outside world, yet finding a quiet joy in her brother's innocent chatter. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating a cocoon of light and warmth against the encroaching darkness outside. The small hut, their world, felt safe, for now. This shared meal, simple as it was a fundamental pillar of their survival in the Dark Ages. It was a ritual of replenishment, a moment of profound connection, and a brief, precious respite from the ceaseless demands of a life that was always, in every conceivable way, harder than anyone could possibly imagine. The darkness outside intensified, but for a short while, the light of their hearth, and the quiet rhythm of their shared lives, held it at bay. As the last embers of the sunset faded from the western sky, a profound darkness descended upon Ethelberg. This was not the light-polluted darkness of later centuries, but an absolute, suffocating blackness, broken only by the pinprick stars, if the clouds allowed, and the faint, flickering glow of hearth fires from within the huts. The air grew heavy and cold, thick with the scent of night-blooming dampness and the distant, unseen mysteries of the wheeled forest. Inside Elara's hut, the evening ritual of preparing for sleep had begun. Lyra, her breathing now more regular after the warmth and sustenance of the meal, was already settled on her pallet, a thick wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Sinric, his earlier energy spent, lay curled beside her, his small body already sinking into the depths of childish slumber, his carved wooden animal clutched loosely in one hand. The fire in the hearth, though still glowing, had been carefully banked, its flames reduced to a low, persistent shimmer, designed to hold the warmth through the long, cold night with minimal fuel. Elara moved quietly, her bare feet silent on the earthen floor. She checked the small, crude wooden bar that secured their hide door flap, ensuring it was firmly in place. It was a flimsy defense, more symbolic than truly impenetrable, but it offered a small measure of psychological comfort against the unseen threats of the night. She listened intently, her senses honed by a lifetime of living on the edge. The sounds of the village outside her hut were slowly fading, one by one. The distant murmur of voices had ceased. The lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep from their pens had quieted. Even the village dogs, usually prone to sporadic barking, seemed to have settled into a wary silence. The silence of the night in Ethelberg was not empty, it was a living, breathing entity, filled with its own unique symphony of sounds, each carrying potential meaning. The rustle of dry leaves driven by a sudden gust of wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the unseen scurry of a field mouse in the thatch. These were the ordinary sounds of the wild, sounds that were comforting in their familiarity, yet also served as a constant reminder of the untamed world that pressed in on all sides. But then there were the other sounds, the ones that tightened the knot of fear in Elara's stomach. The faint, far-off howl of a wolf, closer than she would like. The sudden, unexplained snap of a branch from the direction of the forest. Or, most terrifyingly, the profound, unnatural silence that sometimes descended, hinting at the presence of something larger, something more dangerous than mere animals. Her thoughts, no longer occupied by the physical demands of labor, now gravitated towards the fears that haunted their waking and sleeping hours. The whispers of the Norsemen, the missing scouts, these anxieties now swelled in the oppressive darkness. She imagined their longboats, swift and silent, gliding through the coastal waters, their warriors, fierce and brutal, stepping onto Saxon soil. She pictured the smoke plumes rising from distant settlements, the cries of the helpless, the desolation that followed in their wake. This was the terror of the unknown, magnified 100-fold by the isolation and vulnerability of their age. There was no news of the wider world beyond fragmented rumors, no centralized authority to provide accurate information or coordinated defense. They were on their own, a small, isolated outpost against a tide of encroaching barbarity. Elara finally lay down on her straw pallet, drawing her rough wool blanket close. The cold still seeped into her bones, even with the banked fire. Sleep would be a long time coming. She lay listening, her ears straining, trying to decipher the nuances of the night. Was that a footstep outside, or just the wind? Was that a distant shout, or merely a dream? Every creak of the hut, every shifting shadow, seemed to hold a hidden threat. The boring history of their day had concluded, giving way to the truly, harder than you think, reality of the Dark Ages night. It was a time of heightened senses, of suppressed fears, of deep vulnerability. The darkness was not just an absence of light, it was a canvas for their deepest anxieties, a shroud that concealed every conceivable danger. And as Elara lay there, waiting for the elusive embrace of sleep, she knew that for the people of Ethelberg, night was not a time of rest, but a long, terrifying vigil, a desperate prayer for the safe return of the sun. The night in Ethelberg was a fragile tapestry of hushed sounds and deep, impenetrable shadows, but it was not entirely without vigilance. While most villagers sought the precarious solace of their huts, a select few were chosen for the nocturnal watch, their duty a silent, vital promise of protection against the unseen dangers that lurked beyond the rough wooden palisade. Among them was Edric, a man of 40 winters, whose face was a testament to countless nights spent under the indifferent gaze of the stars. His post tonight was near the main gate, a strategic point where the village was most vulnerable. Edric was not a warrior by trade, but a farmer, like most in Ethelberg. Yet, necessity had forged him into a sentinel. He stood, a silent silhouette against the deeper blackness of the forest, his hand resting on the rough hilt of his short axe, a practical tool now serving a dual purpose as a weapon. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light, constantly scanned the perimeter, searching for any anomaly, any shift in the subtle patterns of the night. His ears were finely tuned to the symphony of natural sounds, instantly recognizing the difference between the rustle of a badger and the stealthy tread of a man, between the hoot of a familiar owl and the mimicked call of an intruder. The air was bitterly cold, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the surrounding woods. Edric's breath plumed invisible clouds, dissolving quickly into the oppressive darkness. He stomped his feet occasionally, trying to keep the blood flowing, to stave off the creeping numbness that threatened to immobilize his limbs. There were no fires allowed at the watch posts, no lanterns to betray their position. Light was a dangerous invitation, a beacon for unwanted attention. Their only source of warmth was the thick, homespun wool of their cloaks and the inner fire of their resolve. His mind, like Elara's, was a constant battleground of worry and vigilance. The rumors of the Norsemen were particularly heavy tonight. He thought of his own family, sleeping soundly, he hoped, within their hut, oblivious to the knife edge on which their collective safety balanced. He thought of the scouts, young men he knew, who had ventured into the dangerous depths of the Weald. Had they found anything? Were they safe? The forest was a deceptive mistress, offering shelter one moment, then swallowing men whole the next. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The moon, when it occasionally broke through the scattered clouds, cast an ethereal, silver light, illuminating the skeletal branches of the trees and casting long, distorted shadows that danced with every whisper of the wind. In such light, every stump could be a lurking figure, every shadow a hidden threat. Edric relied on his experience, his instinct, and the grim knowledge of what was at stake. The sounds of the night intensified the solitude of his watch. The distant shriek of a nocturnal bird of prey, the mournful cry of some unknown creature, the rhythmic sigh of the wind through the tall pines. These sounds, amplified by the darkness, seemed to press in on him, accentuating the vast, untamed wilderness that surrounded their tiny bastion of humanity. He tightened his grip on his axe, his knuckles white. This was the unseen hardness of the dark ages, the constant, psychological toll of living under perpetual threat. It was not just the physical labor, the hunger, or the disease, it was the relentless vigilance, the burden of being the first line of defense, the silent guardian against a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. Edric's role as sentinel was a microcosm of their entire existence, a constant balancing act between the desire for rest and the imperative for survival. He shifted his weight, his eyes never leaving the impenetrable blackness beyond the palisade. The quiet courage of men like Edric, standing alone against the vastness of the night, was the unspoken backbone of Ethelberg. Their unwavering watch, their readiness to face the unknown, was the true unsung heroism of a time often dismissed as boring. For in that darkness, surrounded by the subtle yet terrifying sounds of the wild, Edric knew, with every fiber of his being, that life in the Dark Ages was profoundly and terrifyingly harder than any modern mind could possibly comprehend. The village slept, unaware, while a precious few held back the tide of encroaching danger, one silent, watchful moment at a time. The night, a prolonged vigil of oppressive darkness and gnawing anxiety, finally began to relent. A faint, almost imperceptible gray light seeped into the eastern sky, pushing back the inky blackness with a hesitant, gradual unveiling. For Edric, the sentinel, the first hint of dawn was always a profound relief, a promise of light and the temporary banishment of night's deepest terrors. His muscles ached, his eyes burned with exhaustion, but the rising light brought with it a renewed sense of hope. The air grew even colder just before dawn, the deepest chill of the night, and a thick, swirling mist began to rise from the damp ground, clinging to everything like a shroud. It coiled around the base of the palisade, drifted silently between the huts, and swallowed the distant treeline of the wheeled forest, transforming the familiar landscape into a ghostly, indistinct realm. Sounds were muffled, distorted by the dense fog, turning the ordinary calls of early morning birds into eerie, disembodied whispers. Edric scanned the mist-shrouded perimeter, his visibility severely reduced. This was a dangerous time. Fog could conceal as easily as it could reveal. It was a perfect cover for an approaching enemy, allowing them to draw close without being seen. His grip tightened on his axe, his senses straining, trying to pierce the veil of white that surrounded him. Every snap of a twig, every rustle, was magnified, triggering an instant, primal alarm. And then he saw it. Through a momentary thinning in the swirling mist, just beyond the palisade where the path from the fields joined the open grazing land, he saw movement. Not the familiar lumbering of a cow, nor the quick dart of a fox. This was the distinct, uneven movement of a human form, struggling through the dense fog. Edric stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs. Was it a raider, a lone bandit? He tensed, ready to sound the alarm, his axe raised slightly. But as the figure drew closer, limping and stumbling, a wave of recognition, mixed with a chilling dread, washed over him. It was young Gareth, one of the scouts who had left yesterday afternoon. He was alone. His clothes were torn and mud-splattered, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion and fear. He stumbled forward, collapsing against the palisade, his body shaking uncontrollably. Edric rushed to him, concern overriding his caution. "Gareth, what news? Where are the others?" he demanded, his voice low but urgent. Gareth looked up, his eyes wide and vacant, filled with a horror that chilled Edric to the bone. He tried to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped his lips. His arm, Edric now noticed, was bleeding, a rough bandage clumsily tied around a deep gash. Norseman, Gareth finally choked out, his voice a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the swirling mist. "Many. From the north. They were everywhere. They found us. Theron. Sinewolf. They didn't make it." His words were broken, punctuated by desperate gasps for air and the tremors that racked his body. The other scouts, the young men who had ventured forth to bring news, were dead. The rumors were true, and worse. The words hit Edric like a physical blow. A cold dread, far more profound than the morning chill, settled deep within him. The misty dawn, usually a symbol of renewed hope, now felt like a shroud, an ominous veil descending upon their small, vulnerable village. The hardness of their lives had just intensified tenfold. The abstract fear of distant raids had solidified into a terrifying, immediate threat, right on their doorstep. The dawn brought not solace, but an omen, a chilling confirmation that their boring history was about to become a desperate, life-or-death struggle, harder than any of them could have ever conceived. Gareth's terrified whisper cut through the silence, announcing the arrival of their darkest hour. Gareth's terrified whisper, "Norsemen, they found us," ripped through the quiet of the pre-dawn mist, striking Edric like a physical blow. The sight of the young scout's bloodied arm and haunted eyes was more potent than any spoken word. The abstract fear, which had been a constant low hum in the village's collective consciousness, had just materialized into a brutal, undeniable reality. Edric felt a surge of primal dread, followed almost immediately by a cold, desperate resolve. There was no time for shock, no moment for despair. The village had to be warned. With a guttural shout that tore through his throat, Edric unleashed the alarm. A single, piercing, insistent cry that echoed eerily through the swirling mist and the sleeping huts. "Norsemen, 2 arms. They are here." His voice, usually gruff and low, resonated with an urgency that left no room for doubt. It was the ancient alarm, understood instinctively by every soul in Ethelberg. Within moments, the village, which had been wrapped in the quiet slumber of early morning, erupted into a chaotic frenzy of movement and panicked shouts. The sudden, shrill cry of a woman, the frantic barking of dogs, the confused bleating of startled animals from their pens, these sounds joined Edric's shouts, creating a cacophony of terror. Hut flaps were thrown open, revealing figures silhouetted against the dim glow of their dying hearth fires. Men, still half asleep, stumbled out, clutching whatever crude weapons they could find: axes, spears, even heavy staffs. Women, their faces pale with fear, ushered their children out, their hands trembling as they gathered the most essential belongings. Elara, jolted awake by Edric's urgent cry, felt an immediate, icy wave of dread wash over her. The words, Norseman, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She knew, with an instinctive certainty, what this meant. The whispers were true. The long night of fear had finally given way to a morning of brutal confrontation. "Mother, Sinric, wake up," she cried, her voice strained with urgency. She scrambled from her pallet, her hands fumbling in the darkness for her warm cloak and her small, sturdy digging stick, now her only defense. Sinric, still half asleep, whimpered, clinging to her leg. Lyra, though frail, responded with a surprising surge of energy, her eyes wide with alarm. "The palisade," she gasped, her voice raspy. "We must go to the palisade." The plan, rudimentary as it was ingrained in the villagers' minds. In the event of a raid, all able-bodied men would gather at the palisade to defend the village, while women, children, and the elderly would retreat to the central, most fortified part of Ethelberg, a small, roughly dug trench and earthwork near the communal well, where they would wait for further instructions or, in the worst case, attempt to flee into the forest if the defenses broke. The air outside was now thick with the rising panic. Figures, blurred by the mist, ran frantically through the narrow paths, shouting warnings, calling out names. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of fear and adrenaline. The blacksmith's hammer, which had sounded so comforting hours earlier, was now being used to ring a desperate, clanging alarm on an old wagon wheel, its mournful clang resonating through the fog. Elara grabbed Sinric's hand, her grip tight, pulling him along behind her. She helped her mother to her feet, supporting her frail form. "Quickly, mother, quickly." Her eyes darted towards the main gate, where Edric was now shouting commands, his voice hoarse, rallying the few men who had arrived. The misty dawn, which had promised a new day, had instead delivered their worst nightmare. The boring history of Ethelberg was suddenly thrust into a chaotic, terrifying present. The sheer hardness of their lives, always present, now manifested itself in its most brutal form, a fight for survival against an unknown number of ruthless invaders. Every step, every breath, was now a desperate struggle against imminent annihilation, as the village awoke to the terrifying reality of the Norsemen at their gates. The alarm had ripped through Ethelberg, transforming a slumbering village into a desperate, chaotic hive of activity. The thick, pre-dawn mist, which had provided cover for the approaching raiders, now swirled around the panic-stricken villagers, turning familiar faces into spectral blurs and amplifying the sounds of fear. Men, armed with agricultural tools, hunting spears, and a few scavenged iron axes, sprinted towards the palisade, their movements clumsy with adrenaline and lack of training. Women, clutching children and what few valuables they could snatch, hurried towards the central earthen refuge. Elara, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, helped guide her mother and Sinric through the swirling chaos. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and a grim determination. "Stay close, Sinric. Mother, lean on me," she urged, her voice tight with suppressed panic. The scent of fear, sharp and acrid, mingled with the damp earth and wood smoke. As they reached the rough, wooden palisade, the sight that met them was both terrifying and inspiring. A line of men, perhaps 20 or 30 strong, had already formed, their bodies tense, their eyes straining to pierce the shrouding mist. Edric stood at the forefront near the main gate, his face a mask of grim resolve, shouting desperate instructions. Old Theron, despite his age, stood beside him, his gnarled hands clutching a short, heavy spear. Their numbers were pitifully small against what Gareth had described, many Norsemen. Suddenly, guttural shouts, harsh and alien, erupted from the mist just beyond the palisade. The unmistakable clang of metal on wood echoed through the fog, followed by the terrifying splintering sound of timber. The raiders were not waiting. They were already upon them, leveraging the cover of the mist to launch a swift, brutal assault. The faint, flickering light of torches, carried by the invaders, began to pierce the white veil, casting monstrous, dancing shadows on the palisade walls. "Hold the line," Edric roared, his voice cracking but resolute. The first few arrows, roughly fletched but deadly, whistled through the air, embedding themselves in the wooden palisade with dull thuds. A man beside Theron cried out, clutching his arm where an arrow had struck him. There was no time for help. Every man was needed. Elara pushed her mother and Cynric further back towards the makeshift refuge, her eyes darting between the escalating conflict at the palisade and her vulnerable family. "Hide. Stay low," she urged them, her voice barely a whisper. She saw other women and children huddled together, their faces pale with terror, some weeping silently, others praying to ancient gods for deliverance. The sounds of battle intensified. The thud of heavy boots against the earth, the shouts of the Norsemen, the desperate, guttural cries of the Saxon defenders. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of blood, the acrid scent of wood smoke mixed with the primal smell of fear. The mist, far from offering comfort, now seemed to press in on them, making the space feel claustrophobic, enhancing the sense of unseen threats. A section of the palisade near the western flank groaned ominously, then gave way with a sickening crack, splintering under the concentrated force of a battering ram or multiple axe blows. A gap appeared, and through it, the terrifying figures of the Norsemen materialized from the mist. Tall, bearded men, clad in animal furs and leather, their faces grim and unyielding, wielding axes and swords that gleamed dully even in the weak light. Their war cries, harsh and bloodthirsty, sent shivers of pure terror down Elara's spine. The small band of Saxon defenders surged forward to meet them, a desperate wave against an overwhelming tide. The clash of metal on metal, the wet thud of blows, the screams of the wounded, it was a primal symphony of violence. This was not a heroic charge. It was a desperate, unyielding stand by ordinary people, fighting for their homes, their families, their very lives against a ruthless enemy. Elara watched, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and grim fascination. Her hands instinctively went to her digging stick, a useless piece of wood against their brutal weapons. The boring history of Ethelberg had vanished, replaced by a raw, bloody reality. The hardness of their lives was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical force, crashing down upon them with the fury of a storm. Every agonizing second was a testament to the fact that their existence in the Dark Ages was profoundly, overwhelmingly, and terrifyingly harder than any peaceful mind could ever begin to imagine. The fate of Ethelberg, of their very world, hung by the slenderest of threads, determined in the brutal, chaotic moments that followed. The defense of Ethelberg was a short, brutal, and ultimately, a losing battle. The sheer ferocity and numbers of the Norsemen were overwhelming. The palisade, a symbol of their fragile security, had been breached in multiple places, unleashing the tide of invaders into the heart of the village. The sounds of battle, once confined to the perimeter, now echoed from every corner. The clash of steel, the screams of the dying, the terrifying crackle of flames consuming thatch. Elara, clutching Cynric tightly, her arm wrapped protectively around her mother, Lyra, could only watch in horror from the precarious safety of the central earthwork. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging her eyes and burning her throat. The once familiar aroma of wood smoke from their hearths was now replaced by the acrid, sickening smell of burning timber and something else, something metallic and visceral, the scent of blood. Through the swirling smoke and dwindling mist, she witnessed scenes that would forever be seared into her memory. The desperate, valiant stand of Edric and Theron, their bodies falling amidst a cluster of their foes. The scattered cries of villagers unable to reach the refuge, the terrifying figures of the Norsemen moving like wraiths through the burning huts, their axes rising and falling with ruthless efficiency. The world, which had been so ordered by the daily rhythm of toil, had dissolved into a nightmare of chaos and destruction. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than an hour, the sounds of active combat began to subside, replaced by the crackling roar of fire and the chilling silence of systematic looting. The Norsemen, having broken the village's will to fight, now moved through the huts, seizing what little wealth the villagers possessed: grain, dried meats, tools, anything of value. The cries of anguish from those who had been captured or wounded pierced the air, mingling with the moans of the dying. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her family closer, willing them to be invisible. She could feel Cynric trembling against her, his small face buried in her tunic. Lyra, surprisingly stoic, simply held Elara's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. They lay motionless, huddled with other women and children, hidden by the low earthwork and the lingering pockets of mist, praying that they would go unnoticed. The thought of what would happen if they were discovered was a silent scream in Elara's mind. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the sounds of the raiders began to recede. Their harsh, triumphant shouts faded into the distance. The thud of their retreating footsteps, the creak of their longboats as they were loaded with plunder, grew fainter and fainter. The fire, however, continued its relentless consumption, casting an orange glow on the underside of the lingering smoke clouds. When at last the silence of the night truly returned, it was a silence more profound, more terrifying than any before. It was the silence of devastation. Cautiously, Elara raised her head, peering over the earthwork. The village of Ethelberg was no more. Where familiar huts had stood, only smoldering ruins remained, their skeletons outlined against the fiery glow. The air was thick with ash, falling like macabre snow. The once vibrant sounds of village life were replaced by the mournful hiss of dying fires and the soft, heart-wrenching sobs of the survivors. Slowly, hesitantly, the hidden villagers began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces streaked with ashen tears, their eyes reflecting the horror of what they had witnessed. They moved like ghosts among the ruins, searching for loved ones, for signs of life, for any scrap of what was left. Elara, her body stiff with shock and despair, slowly helped her mother and Cynric to stand. They walked towards where their hut had stood, guided only by memory. There was nothing left but charred timbers and smoking ash. Their meager possessions, their meager home, their fragile sanctuary, all gone. The morning light, now truly breaking, revealed the full extent of the devastation, painting the scene in stark, unforgiving detail. It was a landscape of loss, of profound grief, but amidst the ashes, there was also a flicker, however faint, of resilience. A small group of survivors, perhaps half the village, began to gather. Their faces bore the marks of unimaginable trauma, but in their eyes, Elara saw not just despair, but a stubborn defiance. They had lost everything, but they had their lives, and they had each other. The boring history for sleep had ended in a brutal awakening, demonstrating the undeniable, soul-crushing hardness of life in the Dark Ages. It was a history written in blood and ash, a testament to the constant fragility of existence. Yet, as Elara looked at the faces of her fellow survivors, she knew that even in this darkest hour, the human spirit, however battered, however broken, would find a way to endure. The cycle of rebuilding, of suffering, of surviving, would begin anew. It would be harder than ever before, but they would face it, because that was all they knew. Their story, far from being over, had merely entered a new, even more challenging chapter.